All right, so today we're going to be doing a deep dive into Clayton Christensen's How Will You Measure Your Life? And we're really going to look at how these theories, which are often applied to business, can actually help philosophers, build a more fulfilling life. And I've got our expert on innovation and strategy here to help us unpack it all.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion.
So the first theory that really stood out to me was just because you have feathers, where Christensen uses this analogy of early aviators who, were strapping on wings and feathers and thinking that would make them fly.
Right. They saw the correlation, birds have wings, birds fly, but they totally overlooked like that causal mechanism, the lift. And
Yeah.
that's where Christensen says we need these robust theories, that help us understand the why, not just the what.
Okay, so how does that apply to, like, becoming a successful philosopher? Like, if we just observe, what famous philosophers do, that's not enough, is it?
Exactly. If we just focus on those outward actions, we might miss like the deeper principles at play, the philosophical lift that's actually driving their fulfilling careers.
I like that.
So it's kind of like, are we just mimicking the appearance of deep thought, or are we actually engaging in those rigorous processes that lead to genuine understanding?
Oh, that's a good one. So, like, are there philosophical ostriches out there? Like, people who look the part but haven't quite achieved intellectual flight?
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, those who maybe focus on like the trappings of philosophy but haven't really grappled with its core principles. And that reminds me of something else that Christensen talks about. How so many of his Harvard Business School classmates, despite achieving, outward success, they weren't actually happy.
Yeah, right. It's that whole money can't buy happiness thing. But he takes it a step further, right, with this two-factor theory.
Yeah, exactly. So Hertzberg's two-factor theory talks about these two things, hygiene factors and motivators. And hygiene factors are things like, your salary, your status, job security.
Right, the base.
Important, but not fulfilling on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So think of it this way, you need clean water to survive, but, just drinking water all day isn't going to make you thrive.
Yeah, makes sense.
So it's those motivators, that actually provide, that real satisfaction.
So for a philosopher, would that be like the challenge of tackling complex ideas or, the feeling of making a real contribution to knowledge?
Absolutely. It's about finding those intrinsic rewards, in the work itself. And this applies whether you're in academia or exploring philosophy in other settings.
Right.
Are you chasing, external validation, or are you driven by this genuine love for the pursuit of truth?
Yeah, that's such a crucial question for any philosopher, I think.
Okay, so
Shifting gears a bit, Christensen talks about this really interesting story of Honda entering the U.S. motorcycle market. They were initially like targeting Harley-Davidson customers, but ended up finding huge success with this Super Cub, appealing to like a totally different segment.
Right, right.
So it's like, even with a well-thought-out plan, sometimes you have to kind of pivot based on what reality throws at you.
Absolutely.
But how does that apply to a philosopher, though? We're not selling motorcycles.
Well, think about like your research. You might start out with a specific question in mind, a clear path, but then what happens when you stumble upon this unexpected connection, or a new line of inquiry that wasn't part of your original plan?
Right.
Do you like rigidly stick to that initial trajectory, or do you allow yourself to kind of be pulled in a new and potentially more fruitful direction?
It's that intellectual curiosity, right? Like being open to those new avenues, even if they weren't on the original roadmap.
Yeah.
I guess that could even apply to, choosing which philosophical problems to tackle in the first place, right? Like sometimes the most intriguing ones are the ones we least expect.
Exactly. And sometimes those are the ones that lead to the most like profound insights. It's about finding that balance between having, a clear direction, but also being open to that serendipitous nature of intellectual discovery.
Yeah, it's like you set off on a journey, but you're also willing to adjust course based on, the intellectual terrain that you encounter along the way.
That's a great way to put it. It's like a philosophical choose your own adventure where the most fulfilling path might not be the one you initially set out on.
Okay, so we talked about, finding those right problems and being open to new directions, but Christensen also talks about this whole idea of resource allocation.
Right?
And, he uses that example of his neighbor Steve, who achieved his entrepreneurial dream, but kind of ended up neglecting his family along the way. It's a cautionary tale.
It is. It reminds us that like having a great strategy, whether it's for, building a business or living a fulfilling life, it means nothing if you don't allocate your resources accordingly. We can say that family or relationships are our top priority, but if our time, our energy, our money are consistently flowing elsewhere.
Right. Actions speak louder than words.
Exactly.
And this seems especially relevant for philosophers. I mean, philosophy, it could be so all-consuming, it's easy to get lost in thought and let other aspects of life slide.
Absolutely. And Christensen's theory, highlights that it's this ongoing process, this conscious choice. We have to actively choose to invest in those relationships,
Hmm.
just as we invest, time in our research or our writing or teaching.
So it's not just about being busy with philosophy, it's about being intentional, right, with our time and energy, making sure that those important relationships aren't being starved of attention.
Exactly. And that might mean, setting boundaries or creating dedicated time for loved ones or making sure our philosophical pursuits, don't come at the expense of our personal lives. It's about finding that balance.
Okay, so this next theory is called jobs to be done. And this one is so simple, but it has really profound implications.
Yeah.
So Christensen talks about how this fast food chain was struggling to improve its milkshakes. Like they did all these taste tests and, nothing seemed to work
Right.
until they realized that they weren't just selling milkshakes. They were selling solutions to these jobs that customers were hiring the milkshake for.
Uh-huh.
So for some people, it was a quick breakfast on the go. For others, it was like an afternoon treat with the kids.
Right.
So it wasn't about the milkshake itself. It was about the need that it was fulfilling in that moment.
Yeah.
But how does that apply to philosophy?
Well, it kind of prompts us to ask, what are the jobs that philosophy does, for ourselves, for our students, for society as a whole?
Hmm.
Does it help us make sense of the world? Does it provide a framework for, ethical decision making? Does it offer us solace in times of uncertainty? Does it challenge our assumption?
Right. So it's like asking, what problem am I trying to solve with this philosophical inquiry? Or what need does this, philosophical idea or theory fulfill in my life or in my understanding of the world?
Exactly. And by framing philosophy in terms of these jobs to be done, we might discover, new approaches,
Yeah.
new ways to engage with these big questions, or even new ways to kind of share those philosophical insights with others.
Right. It's almost like we're shifting the focus from the abstract to the practical
Yeah.
and thinking about how can these philosophical ideas actually be applied in real-world context.
Exactly. And that might make philosophy, more accessible to people who might not consider themselves philosophers.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've talked about finding the right problems, allocating our resources, wisely understanding the jobs our work does. But Christensen also talks about this idea of sacrifice. And he uses some pretty personal examples, like putting his own life on hold to care for his dying father.
Right.
And he links that idea of sacrifice to commitment.
Yeah.
So the idea is that we deepen our commitment to something by the sacrifices we make for it.
Right. It's not about self-denial. It's about aligning our actions with our values.
So for a philosopher, is there an inherent element of sacrifice in the pursuit of truth? Are we giving up certain things, maybe material wealth, social status, even personal time, in order to dedicate ourselves to this intellectual pursuit?
Yeah, it's a question worth considering. Think about those who dedicate their lives to research, often working long hours or, foregoing those more lucrative career paths, all in the name of, expanding knowledge.
Mm.
Or those who choose to teach, inspiring the next generation of thinkers, even if it means, sacrificing some personal time or, financial rewards.
And even within our relationships, right? There might be sacrifices involved in supporting a partner's philosophical work
Sure.
or in creating the space and time for deep thought and contemplation.
Absolutely. And, Christensen's theory suggests that these sacrifices, when they're aligned with our deepest values, can actually enrich our lives and deepen our commitment to our pursuits and even strengthen those relationships.
Yeah.
It's about, making those conscious choices that reflect our priorities.
Okay, shifting gears again. Christensen uses this fascinating analogy of Dell outsourcing more and more of its operations to ASUS,
Right.
and ultimately, losing its own PC-making capabilities and being overtaken by, its former supplier.
It's a cautionary tale, about the dangers of just focusing on resources and efficiency without also cultivating the capabilities, the processes, the skills, that allow you to create value.
So it's not just about having the tools, it's about knowing how to use them.
Right.
But how does that apply to a philosopher?
Well, think about it this way, is it enough to just read philosophical texts and attend lectures? Or does it require, actively engaging with those ideas, grappling with those difficult problems, developing those critical thinking skills, those argumentative muscles, even, risking failure in the process of honing our philosophical craft?
It's like the difference between, reading a cookbook and actually getting in the kitchen and cooking.
Exactly.
You might have all the ingredients, but you need to develop the skills to create something, truly delicious.
Exactly. And it's this ongoing process. We're constantly learning and refining our skills and pushing ourselves, beyond our comfort zones to grow.
It's like we're building our philosophical toolkit. And making sure we know how to use each tool.
Exactly. And that toolkit includes, not just knowledge and skills, but also intellectual curiosity, that willingness to experiment, that openness to new ideas and approaches.
Okay, this next theory is about the power of culture. And Christensen uses Pixar as an example.
Right.
And, they have this culture of brutally honest feedback,
Yeah.
even if it delays production, because, priority is making a great film.
Right.
And he emphasizes that, culture isn't just about slogans or mission statements. It's about the ingrained behaviors, the norms, the way problems are solved repeatedly. And he even applies this to families. He says that families, like companies, develop a culture, whether intentionally or not.
That's right.
So for a philosopher, what kind of culture are we creating in our departments or in our research groups or even within ourselves?
It's about asking, do we value rigorous debate? Do we value intellectual honesty, openness to new perspectives?
Yeah.
Or do we fall into that trap of intellectual conformity, prioritizing academic politics over the pursuit of truth?
Right. So it's like, are we building the philosophical house that's sturdy and welcoming,
Right.
or one that's built on shaky foundations and closed off to new ideas?
And that applies to, our individual philosophical house as well.
Yeah.
Are we cultivating a culture of intellectual curiosity within ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
A willingness to challenge our own assumptions?
Yeah.
To embrace that discomfort of uncertainty? Or are we becoming intellectually complacent, settling for easy answers and avoiding the hard questions?
Oh, that's a good one. So it's like, are we inviting new guests into our philosophical home, or are we keeping the doors locked and the blinds drawn?
That's a great way to put it. And it's something that we need to be mindful of, both individually and collectively.
Okay, so the last theory, and this is a big one, especially, for someone dedicated to philosophy, is what Christensen calls full cost versus a marginal cost of just this once. And he gives this example of, being tempted to play in this championship basketball game on a Sunday, even though he'd committed to not playing on the Sabbath.
Right.
It's that slippery slope, that just this once thinking.
Yeah, it highlights that dangerous marginal thinking, justifying those small compromises because the immediate cost seems low.
Yeah, you think just this once won't hurt.
Right, exactly.
But as he points out, those seemingly insignificant choices can really add up.
Yeah.
It's like slowly eroding the foundation of a building, You might not see those cracks at first, but eventually the whole structure becomes unstable.
Exactly.
And so for a philosopher, how does this apply to your intellectual integrity? Like each time you're tempted to take a shortcut in your reasoning or overlook a flaw in an argument,
Yeah.
it's a choice that could ultimately undermine, your credibility and the value of your work.
It is, it's like we're building our philosophical house brick by brick, and if we start using shoddy materials or cutting corners, the whole thing is at risk.
Exactly.
So the challenge becomes, how do we cultivate that discipline, that awareness to make those tough choices, to resist that easy path and hold ourselves to those highest standards.
Yeah.
It's not always easy, but, maintaining that integrity has immeasurable long-term rewards.
That's such a powerful point, and it really gets to the heart of what it means to live a philosophical life, right? Both in our work and our actions. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into how will you measure your life. It's been dense, but I think there's some really valuable insights here for anyone.
Yeah.
Especially, a philosopher who's on this path of, intellectual exploration and self-discovery.
Absolutely. And what I find so compelling about Christensen's work is that it really bridges that gap between theory and practice.
Mm-hmm.
These aren't just abstract concepts. They give us tangible tools for making better decisions.
Right.
For building a life that's both successful and fulfilling on our own terms.
Yeah, exactly. We talked about understanding the why behind our actions.
Yeah.
Allocating our resources to what truly matters. Recognizing the power of culture and shaping our behaviors. We even touched on the pitfalls of that, just this once thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And the importance of constantly developing our philosophical capabilities.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but I really believe that, these are ideas that can have a real impact on how you approach your work, your relationships, and ultimately, how you define success and fulfillment for yourself.
So as you continue on your philosophical journey, consider this. How can you use these insights to not just deepen your understanding of the world,
Mm-hmm.
but to create a life that really reflects your values, your passions, and that unwavering commitment to truth?
Right.
How can you build that philosophical house, that's both intellectually sound and personally fulfilling? It's a question worth pondering as you continue to, navigate the complexities of life and thought.
And remember, the journey itself is just as important as the destination.
Yeah.
So embrace those challenges, those setbacks, even those unexpected turns, because they all offer opportunities to grow, to learn, to discover something new. And, as you wrestle with those big questions and seek those deeper truths, may you find both joy and meaning, in the pursuit and create a life that's truly worthy of your own unique measure.
Beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, may your philosophical explorations be both enlightening and inspiring.